It was late July 2015. My wife and I had decided to take our two kids, Emma, age 9, and Sam, age 7, on a camping trip to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. We'd been camping before, but this was our first time in this area. We had picked a spot along a river at a popular campground nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and rocky terrain. The river was close enough to hear its rushing waters, a sound I found both calming and foreboding as night began to fall. The campground was lively when we arrived, bustling with families and groups of teenagers. A ranger met us at check-in and gave us a rundown of the rules, which included a strong warning to hang our food in a bear bag or use the communal bear-proof lockers provided at the campground. "Bears have been active this season," the ranger had said, his tone serious. "Don't leave food or anything with a strong scent in your tent. Trust me, they'll find it." We'd brought a rope and had read up on how to properly sling our food bag between two trees. After setting up our tent, a roomy 6-person dome that just fit the 4 of us and our gear, I found 2 sturdy trees about 15 feet apart near our site. Following the ranger's advice, I tied the rope between them, slung our food pack over the line, and pulled it up until it was about 12 feet off the ground. It swayed slightly in the cool evening breeze but looked secure. The kids were excited, darting around our campsite while my wife and I finished setting things up. By the time darkness crept in, we were tired but satisfied with our work. The river's murmuring flow blended with the distant laughter of other campers. The fire crackled warmly as we roasted marshmallows and told silly stories. When the fire burned low, we all climbed into the tent, snuggling into our sleeping bags. The kids fell asleep quickly, their breathing soft and even. My wife and I stayed up for a little while, talking in hushed tones about how nice it was to get away from the chaos of everyday life. Eventually, the soothing rhythm of the river and the hum of the forest pulled us into sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The air inside the tent was cool, and the night was silent except for the river and the faint sound of wind brushing through the trees. Something had stirred me, though I couldn't pinpoint what. For a moment, I lay there, listening intently. Then I heard it. A thud, followed by a heavy thump-thump on the ground outside the tent. It sounded like someone jumping. My heart jolted, and I nudged my wife awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She blinked groggily and tilted her head, listening. The sound came again, loud, deliberate. Someone or something was definitely jumping outside our tent. I reached for the flashlight, its cold metal body steadying my nerves. Slowly, I unzipped the tent's door, just enough to peek out. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, and there it was, a bear, a big one, standing beneath our food bag. Its dark fur gleamed in the light as it jumped, powerful hind legs propelling it upward, paws swiping at the pack swaying just out of reach. The bear landed with a solid thud, shook itself, and jumped again. I stared, adrenaline coursing through me. The bear was maybe 20 feet away, focused entirely on our pack. My wife joined me, her breath catching as she saw it. Neither of us said a word. We just watched as the bear kept at it, determined but unsuccessful. It was oddly mesmerizing. The bear would crouch low, spring up, and miss by inches. It seemed to be testing the limits of its reach, studying the pack as if trying to figure out how to get it down. Its grunts and heavy breaths carried through the night. After a while, though, the novelty wore off. It was clear the bear wasn't going to get the pack, and it showed no interest in our tent. My wife and I exchanged a look and, without speaking, zipped the tent back up. We lay there listening to the bear for a while longer before sleep eventually reclaimed us. The morning sunlight filtered through the tent, waking us naturally. The kids were still asleep, sprawled out in their sleeping bags. My wife and I crawled out quietly, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The campsite was peaceful, the chaos of the night before seeming like a distant memory. But as we made our way toward the food bag to retrieve breakfast, we noticed something strange. Several other trees around the campground were littered with bits of rope, and a few packs lay torn and scattered on the ground. The bear had been busy after we'd gone back to sleep. It hadn't gotten our pack, but it seemed to have helped itself to the belongings of some of our neighbors. Around us, people were waking up to the aftermath. A group of teenagers was frantically searching the area, shouting about missing backpacks. Their gear had been shredded and dragged off, presumably into the woods. "Serves them right," my wife muttered under her breath. "Probably didn't hang their bags high enough." We retrieved our food, untouched and secure, and began making breakfast. As the smell of coffee and oatmeal filled the air, I watched the teenagers combing the area, their frustration palpable. One of them muttered something about next time using the lockers. It was a lesson they'd learned the hard way. For the rest of the trip, we heard bits and pieces about the bear. Some campers packed up and left early, unwilling to stay another night after losing their supplies. Others doubled down on their precautions, carefully inspecting their bear bags and tying them higher. As for us, we finished our trip without further incident, but the memory of that jumping bear stayed with me. It was a reminder that nature is both beautiful and unpredictable, and that when camping in bear country, it's always better to be overprepared than to underestimate the wildlife. When we got home, Emma couldn't stop telling her friends about how we'd outsmarted a bear. Sam, on the other hand, had taken to sleeping with a flashlight by his bed. I suppose we all took something different away from that trip, but one thing was certain: we'd never forget it. It was late summer 2018, and I had decided to hammock camp for the first time during a solo trip. I'd been craving a break from the chaos of work and life and thought a weekend of solitude in nature would be the perfect remedy. I chose a remote camping area in northern Wyoming, out by the Bighorn National Forest, because of its rugged beauty and isolation. I'd read about how breathtaking it was, how the stars seemed close enough to touch, and how the silence could bring clarity to a cluttered mind. But there's a thin line between peaceful solitude and unnerving isolation, and I learned that line is a lot thinner when you're alone in a hammock in the middle of nowhere. The drive to the forest was uneventful, though I'd noticed a strange vibe when I stopped at a small gas station on the way. The man at the counter, an older guy with sun-leathered skin and a permanent scowl, didn't say a word when I paid for my gas. He just stared at me like I'd wandered into the wrong part of the world. Outside, a group of locals leaned against the side of a rusty pickup truck, smoking and watching me as I filled up. Their bug-eyed stares made my skin crawl, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Not everyone had to be friendly. I got back into my car and drove on, shaking off the unease. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. The campground was mostly empty, just a couple of old trailers parked in the far lot, and a lone tent set up down by the river. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant rush of water. It was exactly what I'd wanted. Quiet, secluded, and beautiful. I hiked about a mile from the main lot to find a spot that felt private but not too far off the beaten path. I found two sturdy trees near a clearing and set up my hammock between them. It took some trial and error to get the straps at the right height, but eventually it looked secure. I laid my sleeping bag inside, unpacked a few essentials, and set up a small camp stove to make dinner. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, I was feeling more at ease. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into my hammock, zipping myself into the sleeping bag and pulling the mosquito net over me. It was cozy in a strange way, like being in a cocoon. The gentle sway of the hammock and the rhythm of the wind in the trees began to lull me to sleep. I don't know what woke me. It might have been the sound of an engine in the distance, or maybe just the shift in the air. I opened my eyes, disoriented, and lay still, listening. The forest was dark, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're underwater. The only light came from the faint glow of the stars above, barely visible through the tree canopy. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling noise, growing louder. It sounded like a motorcycle or an ATV, and it was coming closer. My heart started pounding as I lay there, frozen. The sound cut off abruptly, and silence rushed back in. A moment later, I heard the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Someone was walking into my camp. I stopped breathing. My body went rigid, my fingers gripping the edges of the hammock. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, each one louder than the last. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The presence was undeniable, and it was close. Too close. The footsteps stopped about 6 feet from where I lay. I stared straight ahead, my heart thundering in my chest. My hammock, my little cocoon of safety, suddenly felt like a trap. I was suspended in midair, helpless, with no way to defend myself. The mosquito net cast a faint shadow over the figure standing there, a dark silhouette against the faint starlight. I couldn't tell if it was a man or something else. My mind raced, replaying every horror story I'd ever heard. Was this a park ranger, a lost hiker, or something worse? The stillness stretched on, the kind of silence that feels alive. I wanted to move, to say something, but fear kept me paralyzed. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't hear breathing, but I could feel its attention, sharp and unnerving. My mind jumped to dark possibilities. Kidnappers, serial killers, mountain men looking for a new wife. The stories of Carrie Swenson, the Olympic biathlete abducted in Montana years ago, flashed through my mind. I was alone, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared. Finally, the figure turned and walked away, its footsteps receding into the night. The sound of the engine fired up again, closer this time, and roared off into the distance. I lay there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When dawn broke, I was still awake, though I'd spent most of the night in a state of hyper-alert exhaustion. The morning light filtered through the trees, making the world feel a little less menacing. I climbed out of my hammock, my legs stiff and shaky, and inspected the campsite. Nothing looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to leave the forest behind. The hike back to the lot felt longer than it should have, every sound in the woods making my heart race. When I reached the trailhead, I half expected to see someone waiting for me, but the lot was empty except for my car and the 2 trailers from the day before. As I drove out of the forest, relief began to wash over me, but it was tinged with lingering unease. Wyoming's wild beauty had always drawn me in, but now it felt tainted. The locals I'd encountered, the strange man in my camp, the unsettling vibe. It all added up to a place that felt more hostile than welcoming. I found myself vowing never to camp alone there again, at least not without better preparation. That experience stayed with me long after I got home. I told myself it was probably just a park ranger checking campsites, that I'd overreacted. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Whoever or whatever had stood 6 feet away from me that night had felt wrong. Like they didn't belong there, like I didn't belong there. And maybe I didn't. I had worked under Sarah for about 2 years. She was one of those bosses who was strict but fair, always expecting the best but never asking for anything she wouldn't do herself. She wasn't the type to take vacations often, so when she invited me to join her and her mom on a camping trip in South America, I was surprised. I didn't know her mom well, but Sarah spoke about her often. a tough woman who had raised Sarah and her two siblings on her own. I figured a camping trip with them would be a great chance to bond and, honestly, score some brownie points with my boss. We decided to camp near a small, remote village in the mountains of northern Chile. Sarah had visited the area before and assured me it was stunning. Crystal clear rivers, thick forests, and a perfect view of the Andes. It sounded like an adventure, so I didn't hesitate to agree. We flew to Santiago and rented an old SUV to drive up to the mountains. The journey took hours, with winding roads cutting through jagged cliffs and dense greenery. Sarah drove while her mom, Linda, navigated. I sat in the back, trying to soak in the scenery and ignore the slight unease creeping up my spine. The farther we drove, the more isolated we became. By the time we reached the village closest to our campsite, the sun was setting. The village was tiny, just a cluster of homes with tin roofs and a single dusty road running through it. We stopped at a small store to grab some last-minute supplies. The shopkeeper, an older man with leathery skin and a serious expression, watched us closely as we loaded up on snacks and water. "You're camping nearby?" he asked Sarah, his tone flat but curious. "Yes, just a few miles up the trail," she replied casually. He didn't say anything else but gave a small nod. Something about his silence unsettled me, but I brushed it off. We drove another 20 minutes before reaching a dirt trail that led to the campsite. The SUV struggled over the uneven terrain, but we eventually arrived at a clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was beautiful and quiet, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. We set up our tents quickly as the last light of day faded. Linda lit a small campfire while Sarah and I unpacked our gear. By the time we were done, the stars were out, dotting the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. The silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an animal. That night, we sat around the fire, eating canned food and sharing stories. Linda told us about her childhood, growing up in a remote part of Argentina, while Sarah and I laughed over office anecdotes. Felt good, relaxing even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it felt strange. We turned in early, each retreating to our tents. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. At first, it was peaceful, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else, a faint snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal, I told myself. Probably a deer or some other harmless creature. But the sound came again, closer this time. I strained my ears, trying to make out any other noises. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. Then, I heard it, a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it through the thin fabric of the tent. The beam of light didn't reveal anything unusual, but the noise had stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I didn't mention what I heard. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and besides, it could have been anything. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking along narrow trails that wound through the forest. Sarah was in her element, pointing out different plants and landmarks, while Linda kept us entertained with her dry humor. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting again. We cooked a quick dinner and settled in for another quiet evening. That's when things started to go wrong. While we were sitting by the fire, Sarah suddenly stood up, staring into the darkness beyond the clearing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. Linda and I exchanged a glance. "Hear what?" I asked cautiously. "Footsteps," Sarah said. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant hum of the forest. "You're imagining things," Linda said with a dismissive wave. Sarah didn't reply. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but branches and leaves. Still, the uneasy feeling from the night before returned, stronger this time. We decided to call it a night, each retreating to our tents earlier than usual. I lay awake again, listening. This time, the noises started almost immediately. Soft footsteps, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, my heart racing. The steps were deliberate, almost cautious, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be noticed. I wanted to call out to Sarah or Linda, but fear kept me silent. Instead, I gripped the small knife I had brought with me, clutching it tightly as I waited for the sounds to stop. They didn't. The footsteps circled the camp for what felt like hours. Occasionally, they would stop only to start again a few minutes later. At one point, I thought I heard a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, the noises stopped. I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. Sarah and Linda were already up, both looking as tired as I felt. "Did you hear it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Linda didn't say anything, but her expression was grim. We decided to cut the trip short. As much as we tried to rationalize what had happened, none of us wanted to spend another night out there. We packed up quickly and started the long hike back to the SUV. The forest felt different that morning, heavier, almost oppressive. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the SUV, I felt a wave of relief. We loaded up our gear and started the drive back to the village. But the relief didn't last long. About halfway down the trail, Sarah slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the road, blocking our path, was a pile of rocks. They weren't there before. We sat in stunned silence, staring at the makeshift barricade. "Who would do this?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. No one answered. Sarah put the SUV in reverse, trying to maneuver around the rocks, but the trail was too narrow. We had no choice but to get out and move them ourselves. As we worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us. But the forest was still almost unnaturally so. We finally cleared the path and got back in the SUV, driving as fast as the rough road would allow. When we reached the village, we didn't stop. We drove straight through, heading for the nearest town with a decent-sized hotel. That night, as I lay in a real bed for the first time in days, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. Who or what had been out there with us? I didn't sleep much that night either. We never talked about it after that. Sarah and Linda seemed eager to forget the whole ordeal, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. But sometimes, late at night, I think back to those footsteps circling our camp, the pile of rocks blocking our way, and the oppressive silence of the forest. I still don't know what really happened out there, and maybe it's better that way. Some things are better left unanswered. It was late June 2017, and my brother-in-law, Mike, and I had decided to go camping in northern Minnesota, deep in the Boundary Waters. It was a tradition we had started a few years back, a way to escape the rush of everyday life and reconnect with nature. The area was known for its dense forests, pristine lakes, and abundant wildlife. I'd always thought the isolation was part of the charm, but after that trip, I realized it could also be a source of danger. We'd hiked for miles to find a secluded spot along the edge of a small, crystal-clear lake. The area was perfect, quiet, remote, and surrounded by towering pines. The only sounds were the chirping of birds, the occasional splash of fish, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was everything we'd hoped for. We set up our tents near the tree line, not too far from the water, and spent the day fishing and exploring the area. As evening fell, we cooked a simple dinner over the campfire, swapping stories and jokes as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange. By the time the stars appeared, we were both ready to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and quickly drifted off to sleep, lulled by the distant calls of loons echoing across the lake. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night to a loud crashing sound. My first thought was that a tree had fallen nearby, but as I sat up and listened, I realized the noise was coming from Mike's direction. It sounded like something large was stomping through the campsite. My heart began to race as I unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The moon cast a pale light over the campsite, and at first, I didn't see anything. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near Mike's tent. A massive shadow loomed over it, an animal impossibly large. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A moose. I'd heard stories about moose, how they could be aggressive and unpredictable, especially during mating season. But nothing prepared me for seeing one up close. It towered over the tent, its long legs and huge antlers making it look almost otherworldly. Algae hung from its antlers like tattered streamers, and its breath came out in heavy puffs, visible in the cool night air. Without warning, the moose stepped forward, one of its massive legs catching the edge of Mike's tent. The fabric crumpled under its weight, and the whole thing collapsed in an instant. There was a muffled yell from inside as Mike was knocked to the ground. The moose didn't seem to notice or care. It continued walking, heading toward the lake. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding. Mike was struggling to free himself from the tangle of fabric and poles. When he finally emerged, he was clutching his side and wincing in pain. His face was pale, and I could see the faint outline of a bruise already forming on his ribs. "Are you okay?" I asked, though my voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw the moose's attention back to us. Mike didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the moose as it waded into the lake. The animal's sheer size was staggering. Its back was taller than Mike, who stood over 6 feet, and its antlers spanned wide enough to brush against the low-hanging branches on either side of the path. The water barely reached its knees as it splashed around, its deep bellows echoing across the lake. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part roar, part groan, and entirely unsettling. Mike finally exhaled and lowered himself onto a log, still holding his side. "I think it bruised my ribs," he said, his voice tight with pain. I inspected the damage as best I could in the dim light. The bruise was nasty, a dark, angry purple that stretched across his side. It was clear the moose's hoof had come dangerously close to causing much worse damage. Just a few inches higher, and it could have crushed his chest. A few inches lower, and his arm might have been snapped like a twig. We sat there in silence, watching the moose as it splashed in the lake. It moved slowly, its massive antlers dripping with algae as it dipped its head into the water. Despite the fear and adrenaline still coursing through me, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. The moose was majestic in a way that only something so wild and untamed could be. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. After what felt like an eternity, the moose began to move again. It waded out of the lake, water streaming off its legs, and disappeared into the trees on the far side of the campsite. The sound of its heavy footsteps gradually faded into the distance, leaving us alone once more. The rest of the night was tense. Mike insisted he was okay, but I could tell he was in pain. His tent was destroyed, so we rigged up a makeshift shelter using a tarp and some rope. Neither of us slept much. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made us jump, our nerves frayed by the encounter. By morning, the bruise on Mike's side had darkened further, and he moved gingerly as we packed up camp. We decided to cut the trip short and head back to the trailhead. The hike out was slow and arduous, with Mike stopping frequently to catch his breath. When we finally reached the car, the relief was palpable. The Boundary Waters, once a place of beauty and tranquility, now felt dangerous and unpredictable. As we drove away, Mike leaned back in his seat, wincing as the motion jostled his ribs. "I'll stick to cabins next time," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Couldn't blame him. The wilderness had shown us just how fragile we were in the face of its power, and it was a lesson neither of us would soon forget. Looking back, I'm grateful the encounter wasn't worse. Mike's injuries, though painful, were relatively minor considering what could have happened. But that trip changed the way I think about camping. The wilderness is beautiful, yes, but it's also unpredictable and, at times, dangerous. You can plan for a lot of things, but there's no preparing for a 1,000-pound moose deciding to walk through your tent in the middle of the night. Now, whenever I camp, I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, scanning the treeline for movement. The Boundary Waters are still one of the most stunning places I've ever visited, but that night, they reminded me that nature doesn't care about your plans or your safety. I'll never forget the camping trip I took with my ex-wife, Lisa. It was late September, years after our divorce. We were in our mid-30s, trying to make peace for the sake of our kids. They weren't with us this time, though. This trip was just the two of us. A strange idea she proposed to reconnect as friends. I agreed because I thought it might help us bury the bitterness that had festered for years. We chose a spot in the remote part of Oregon, a state neither of us had explored much. The campsite was near a dense forest at the base of a mountain range. It wasn't a marked campground, just an area I found on a hiking forum that promised isolation and natural beauty. The drive to the site was uneventful. Lisa and I had our awkward silences, but we managed to chat a bit about work and the kids. By the time we arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the tree line. I parked the car in a clearing near a trailhead, and we began unloading our gear. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy, damp smell of the woods. It felt peaceful, though I couldn't shake the tension between us. The trail to the campsite was about a mile long. We followed it in silence, Lisa leading the way with her flashlight while I carried the heavier gear. The trail narrowed as we went deeper, and I noticed how quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was unsettling, but I didn't mention it. I didn't want to come across as paranoid. We reached a small clearing by a stream just as the last light faded. It was a perfect spot, flat ground, access to water, and surrounded by towering pine trees. We set up the tent quickly and started a small fire. Lisa sat by the flames while I gathered more wood, the shadows from the firelight dancing on the trees. Dinner was simple, canned soup and some bread. We didn't talk much, but the silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. The fire crackled, and the stars came out, brighter than I'd seen in years. For a moment, I thought the trip might actually be a good idea. But then, things started feeling off. It began when I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I glanced at Lisa, but she didn't seem to notice. I brushed it off as my imagination and focused on the fire. Then it happened again. A soft, distant sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but my nerves were on edge. I told myself it was the isolation getting to me. Lisa must have noticed my unease because she asked if I was okay. I nodded, not wanting to seem paranoid. After finishing dinner, we doused the fire and climbed into the tent. It was a two-person tent, small and cramped. We settled in our sleeping bags, the awkwardness of sharing such close quarters palpable. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the silence outside. And then the sound came again, louder this time. It was a crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Another crunch, closer now. I turned to Lisa, but she was already looking at me, her eyes wide. She had heard it too. We didn't say anything, just lay there, listening. The crunching stopped, replaced by a low, dragging sound. It was coming from the direction of the stream, moving slowly toward us. I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam illuminated the tent walls, but nothing outside. I felt trapped, vulnerable. Whatever it was close. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, then silence. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight, listening for any hint of movement. Lisa eventually fell asleep, but I couldn't. My mind raced with possibilities, an animal, maybe a person. But who would be out here this late, in such a remote place? The next morning, we found tracks near the stream. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, but the pattern was strange, uneven. Whoever or whatever made them had an irregular gait. I tried to play it down, telling Lisa it was probably an old trail someone had used recently. She didn't seem convinced, but we decided to stay for one more night. We spent the day hiking and gathering firewood, trying to keep busy and shake off the unease. The forest was beautiful during the day, the sunlight filtering through the trees, but I couldn't fully enjoy it. The tracks stayed in the back of my mind, a nagging reminder that we weren't as alone as we thought. That night, we built the fire bigger and stayed up later, talking about anything to keep the silence at bay. I kept my knife close, a small comfort against the growing dread. As the hours passed, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees looked taller, the shadows darker. Then, around midnight, we heard it again. The crunching. This time, it was unmistakable. Came from the direction of the trail, deliberate and steady. Lisa froze, her eyes locked on mine. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the beam only reached so far. The crunching stopped just beyond the light. We sat there for what felt like hours, listening. Then, a new sound, a low guttural groan, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something in between. The groan came again, closer this time. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip tight. We had to leave. I grabbed the essentials, flashlights, the knife, and the car keys, and we started down the trail, the fire still burning behind us. The trail was darker than I remembered, the trees pressing in from all sides. Every step felt like a struggle, the weight of the darkness bearing down on us. I kept the flashlight pointed ahead, scanning for any sign of movement. Then, the groan came again, closer than ever. I turned, shining the light into the trees. For a split second, I saw something, a figure hunched and misshapen, just beyond the beam. It moved, and the light caught a glint of something metallic. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a creature. It was a person carrying a tool or weapon. We ran. Lisa was ahead of me, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted. My heart pounded, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, couldn't. The groan followed us, a low, menacing sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Lisa yanked the door open and climbed in as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, just the empty forest. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on the highway. Neither of us spoke, the silence filled with unspoken fear. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we could explain or rationalize. It was just wrong. I never went camping again after that. Lisa and I never talked about it, and our relationship remained distant. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those tracks by the stream, the groan in the darkness, and the glint of metal in the trees. and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. I was 28 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It was late October of 2016, and the leaves were in full display of reds, yellows, and oranges. I had been working non-stop in a cramped office for months and needed some time away from everything: people, screens, and the never-ending noise of the city. My plan was simple: pack up my gear, drive out to a remote spot in the forest, and spend a quiet weekend under the stars. The spot I chose wasn't a marked campsite. It was deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania, a place I'd scouted during a hiking trip earlier that summer. The area was secluded but accessible enough with a bit of hiking. I wanted isolation, and this seemed perfect. I parked my car at the edge of a gravel road, loaded my backpack, and started the hike. It was a good 3 miles to the spot I'd picked, far enough to keep me away from any casual visitors, but not so remote that I'd get completely lost. The air was crisp, and the sound of crunching leaves beneath my boots was oddly calming. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The spot was even better than I remembered, tucked between tall pines and bordered by a narrow creek that glistened in the fading sunlight. I set up my tent near the water, unpacked my sleeping bag, and gathered enough firewood to last through the night. Everything felt peaceful. As night fell, I lit a small fire and sat by it, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustle of leaves and distant hoots of an owl were comforting reminders that I was far from the chaos of my daily life. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, leaned back, and stared at the stars. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The air was cold, but my sleeping bag was warm. I drifted off quickly, lulled by the gentle flow of the creek nearby. I woke up abruptly a few hours later. At first, I wasn't sure why. Everything was dark, and the forest was silent except for the faint gurgle of the creek. I lay still, my heart pounding, straining to hear anything unusual. After a minute or two, I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox. I had read about wildlife in the area, and nothing dangerous was known to roam these woods. Still, the sound unnerved me. It was steady, deliberate, and far too rhythmic for an animal. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening. The footsteps eventually faded away, and exhaustion took over. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had overreacted. I'd read that the woods could play tricks on your mind at night. Sunlight filtered through the trees as I cooked breakfast, and the world seemed normal again. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the creek and gathering more firewood. I found some old tire tracks near a narrow trail about half a mile from my camp. They looked faded, like they'd been there for years, and I didn't think much of it. As evening approached, I returned to my camp, ate dinner, and lit the fire again. The night was colder than the previous one, and I wrapped myself in a blanket as I watched the flames dance. The stars were bright, but the forest felt darker, heavier. I went to bed earlier that night, hoping for an uninterrupted sleep, but around midnight, I woke up again. This time, the sound was closer. Crunching leaves, the snap of a twig. It was the same deliberate pattern as the night before. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The sound moved around the perimeter of my camp, pausing every few steps. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling me. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? A hunter? But why would they be out here in the middle of the night, sneaking around? I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife I'd brought for safety. The footsteps eventually stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of my camp, the ground was disturbed. Leaves had been pushed aside, revealing patches of bare dirt. There were footprints, not animal tracks. These were unmistakably human. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. But as I was packing, I noticed something else. A tree about 10 feet from my tent had been marked. 3 deep slashes ran down the bark, too clean to be from an animal. I started the hike back to my car, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. The woods, which had felt so serene when I arrived, now felt oppressive. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made me flinch. About a mile from where I'd parked, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Tied to a tree along the path was a piece of cloth. It was bright red and looked freshly torn, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I hadn't noticed it on my way in. I didn't stop to inspect it. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, and I obeyed. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. But as I unlocked the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was mud on the driver's side door handle, smeared in long streaks. I didn't stick around to figure out how it got there. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped down the gravel road without looking back. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened during that trip. I've told myself it was probably just some other camper messing around, maybe even a hunter who didn't realize how close they were to my camp. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. I haven't been camping alone since. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 28 at the time. I had taken some time off work to decompress and decided a solo camping trip would be the best way to clear my head. I wasn't new to camping. I'd been going out into the woods since I was a teenager. This time, I picked a spot deep in the Adirondacks, near a remote lake called Silver Pine. It wasn't a designated campground, just an area I found on a map that seemed far enough from everything. That was the whole point. No people, no noise, just nature. I arrived late in the afternoon. The trail to the lake wasn't marked, and I had to rely on my GPS and some old-fashioned orienteering skills to find it. After about a 3-hour hike through dense forest, I finally reached the lake. It was breathtaking. The water was still and reflected the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. Pine trees lined the shore, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. There wasn't a single sign of civilization, just me and the wild. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the water under a tall pine tree. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled like damp earth and resin. After setting up camp, I started a small fire using the wood I'd gathered along the way. I made some instant noodles and brewed a cup of coffee. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and the forest around me came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant frogs. It was perfect, or so I thought. Around 9 p.m., the moon was out, casting a faint glow over the lake. I was sitting by the fire, staring at the flames, when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the woods behind me. I froze, listening intently. Could have been anything. A squirrel, a raccoon, maybe even a deer. The woods are full of life, and it's normal to hear animals moving around. But this sound was different. It wasn't the quick, sporadic movements of a small animal. It was deliberate, like someone or something was walking. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but tree trunks and undergrowth. The sound stopped. I stood there for a minute, scanning the forest, my heart pounding. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination or maybe a deer that got spooked by my light. I sat back down by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest was quieter now, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every little noise seemed amplified in the silence. My mind kept going back to that sound I'd heard earlier. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly to a sharp, snapping sound. It was close, too close. My first thought was that it was a branch breaking underfoot. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then I heard it again. Deliberate, slow footsteps circling my tent. Panic set in. My first instinct was to grab my knife. I always carried one in my bag, along with a small can of bear spray. I reached for both, clutching them tightly as I lay there, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear heavy breathing, low and steady. It wasn't an animal. Couldn't be. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I thought about unzipping the tent and confronting whoever or whatever it was, but fear paralyzed me. Instead, I stayed still, hoping whoever it was would leave. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the breathing and footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there in my sleeping bag, gripping my knife and bear spray, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest looked the same as it had the day before, calm, peaceful, and completely ordinary. But I knew better. I walked around the campsite, looking for any signs of what or who had been there. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft dirt around my tent. They were human, barefoot, and large. They circled my tent several times before leading back into the woods. My stomach turned. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The thought of someone watching me, possibly even following me, made my skin crawl. The hike back to my car felt like an eternity. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't stop to rest, even when my legs started to ache. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. I never went back to Silver Pine Lake. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a hermit living off the grid. Maybe it was someone with darker intentions. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before or since. The woods are beautiful, but they're also vast and untamed, and sometimes they remind you how small and vulnerable you really are.